right, here we go. All right. Hello, family. How are y'all this morning? Good. Okay, hey, did anybody do something fun over spring break? Ava, what'd y'all do? Went to Gulf Shores. Awesome. All right, what'd you do? Ah, yeah. Did y'all go together? No, probably not. Safari Zoo. Like the Nashville Zoo? Ah, that's cool. Sophie. You're awesome. How old are you? 13 years old. That is amazing. Hey, that's awesome. What are you doing in New York? Just ah, that's awesome. Awesome. Well, I hope all of you guys had a good break. And do y'all have to go back to school tomorrow? Ah. Well, hey, thank you guys for being here. We'll get through some announcements, and then we'll get to Bible class. So the first thing that we've got this week is Silas here. Silas, tell us about Dig this week. I would go to Dig. That's awesome. All right, so Dig's happening. Impact is happening. Is Larkin here? Larkin, you want to tell us about Impact this week? Awesome. All right, so we got high school girls Devo, high school guys Devo happening Monday from 6 to 8. You guys should be a part of that. Next slide is the spring retreat. We are going to announce on Wednesday night the theme of the spring retreat, so stay tuned. You can go ahead and get signed up for that. This is something that you guys definitely need to be inviting your friends to. It's going to be a really, really awesome retreat. So the sign-up sheet is there. Reveal is going to drop on Wednesday, so stay tuned for that. Next slide. Serve Others Day. This is next Sunday. So you guys, if you would, scan this QR code. It's going to give you a ton of options for next Sunday to sign up and find a way to serve. It's going to be a really awesome Sunday, so I hope that you'll get signed up for that. And if you have any questions, you can ask me. There's two seniors dedicated to every service opportunity. So you're not going to show up and be the only youth group kid there. There's already going to be some seniors and some other people that get signed up. So scan the QR code, sign up for that. It's going to be a really awesome day. Next slide. Okay, today is the 15th. Today is the deadline to get a T-shirt designed and send it in to Philip or I. And so we've had some really, really funny and weird and awesome submissions so far. But it's not too late to become the winner and have your shirt produced and handed out to guests. So that's the deadline today. Next slide. Okay, Deuteronomy, we're about halfway through it, but still never too late to hop in on this. This is what we're reading this month. I think this is the last slide. But something else that you guys need to know is High Steps happening today, and the Lebanon boys flag football game is happening today. So Silas, anything you want to tell? Any details on the flag football game that's happening today? Awesome. That's going to be awesome. So if you're not doing anything this afternoon, text Silas. Y'all go out to eat, and then y'all have fun playing football. So that's happening today. Tim Martin is going to be teaching the high school class, so it's going to be awesome. And the rest of us will go to our usual classes. 6th grade is going to be with Mr. Joe today in the timeline room. So that's where the 6th graders are going, and the 7th graders will be there. 8th graders will be upstairs. So thank you guys so much for being here. Henry's going to say a prayer for us this morning, and then we'll be dismissed to class. So thank you guys for being here.
Dear Lord, thank you for today. I pray that during the lesson that we can take in your word and use it in our daily life, and that you keep us safe today. And yeah, thank you that we get to be here on Sunday and get to worship and praise you. In your son Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Maybe now? Yeah. All right. Good morning. Y'all are very lively. I know a lot of you guys have been gone on spring break. Hopefully you had good trips. My wife and I went to Disney with the Williams family last week, so we're kind of tired and being back from that. I'm excited to be over. Philip asked me to come. Many of you have been in some of my classes before over here, and he asked me to teach 4 weeks and to cover what we call the Torah, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament. That's obviously going to be a challenge to do in 4 weeks. But the way I've kind of arranged it is kind of introduce things this week a little bit, explain why I even use that word to talk about that. We'll talk about why it's important to read that. I'm very excited that you guys are reading through Deuteronomy. I know that that can be very cumbersome because there is a lot of legal code in Deuteronomy and not a lot of narrative or not a lot of stories that maybe you see when you read like Genesis or something, where it's a little more exciting because you see people kind of going through their life and doing things. And so I appreciate the fact that you guys who are sticking with that are doing it. Hopefully today, in the next few weeks, we'll give a little bit of color to that. And why is it important? Because you read about that stuff and you're like, we don't do any of that stuff anymore. We don't sacrifice animals. We don't observe these certain days. And it just seems to go over and over again. Today we'll talk a little bit. I'm going to assume, I'm not going to assume anything. I'm not going to assume that you got a lot of background on Deuteronomy. So if I do recover some territory that you've already covered, I apologize for that in that way. So today I'm just going to kind of introduce what we're going to talk about. I'm going to try not to be too dry and boring, but this is not an uber exciting thing, and maybe not, you would think, it doesn't have a lot of application in your life, but it does. Because one of the things I want you to get from this is, and I hope that you're getting from your reading, anytime you're reading in the Old Testament, is that all of the library that we call the Bible has application in our Christian lives. And we can learn something about God from all of these books and the books that you are reading. And one of the beautiful things to learn about God while you're reading through Deuteronomy, and you're like, all these rules that I keep hearing, all these laws that I keep hearing, is the God of the Hebrew people, the only true God, is also the only God that gave His people expectations. Here's what I want you to do, and if you do these things, good things will happen to you. I will bless you. And if you don't do these things, bad things will happen. And spoiler alert, they don't do. Ultimately, they don't do what God has them to do. If they had in the first place, you wouldn't even have the book of Deuteronomy. Because Deuteronomy, as you've read, is the second giving of the law to the next generation of Israelites, because the first Israelites didn't decide to have faith in God and enter into the promised land 40 years before when they had the opportunity, and they were given the law the first time at Mount Sinai, mainly contained the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And so I hope to make this a little bit exciting. I will say I kind of messed up my slides because I didn't know the software that was going to be over here, so I hope that they work okay. And I'm going to have to advance mine up here while I'm advancing yours. So I apologize, that's going to be a little awkward, but I'm going to do my best. I've been using this word Torah, and it, I know, is a strange new word to most of you. I use it for a reason, because often, even in the New Testament, when Paul refers back to these first 5 books of the Old Testament, he will refer to them as what word? Do you know what word he refers to them as? I've used it this morning a few times. No, he doesn't use Torah, unfortunately. Torah is a Hebrew word. But he says law. You may be referred to, sometimes Jesus may say the law of Moses, or those talking to him. He uses the word law. And unfortunately, that word, even in Greek, he mentioned the word, like we were talking about the Hebrew word Torah, is a correct term, because there's a lot of law code in there. There's a lot of rules, just like we have laws today, right? Think about the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as Israel's constitution. Or their legal code, like people have today. We have a Tennessee code of laws. There's a federal code of laws. All these things are in writing, have been passed by government bodies, and they're rules that have to be followed. But one of the things about the richness of the Hebrew word Torah is that it means more than just law. It really means instruction or teaching. And something that's special about that is, even when we read what I would call the stories, the narrative portions of Genesis, where we read about people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and the portions of Exodus, like when we read about Moses and his brother Aaron, and the Exodus from Egypt, and all of the plagues and that. Those are very interesting, and we think those are just stories, but they're not just stories. There are things that God did in the lives of His people so that one day when we read them and all the Israelites that came, the people that came before us read them, the people of Israel, they learn something about God's relationship with His people. And it's very different than everybody in their world would have thought. Their gods, the people that, let's just say the Egyptian gods that they believed in, or the Assyrian gods, or other people, they were what we would call very capricious gods, meaning they just kind of do whatever they want. If they want to be nice to human beings this week, they'll be nice to them. But if they get a notion, they'll be mean to them, or they'll cause them to be punished, or they'll use them as playthings, and they just really don't care. But the God that we see revealed in the Old Testament is a deity that created and loves His creation and wants them to have a relationship with Him, desires that for them, and He loves them. And that's very, very different and very, very unusual. And so this word Torah may be strange to you, but I'm going to use it from now on because I think it accurately describes the instruction and teaching that we can see. Like, for example, in the life of Abraham. And I know not everybody here knows Abraham's story. But Abraham had a relationship with God that seemed to be a little bit of a roller coaster at times. Joseph had a relationship with God that at the beginning he was a spoiled brat, but he learned to be a very, very faithful person. He went through a lot of persecution, but he stayed faithful to God. And we see that God rewarded him in the end. And so that's very important for us to know. This is what the word Torah looks like in Hebrew. I know you got up this morning, and the very first thing you wanted to do was to know what the word Torah looked like in Hebrew. But I show you this because it's a strange-looking language to you, and it should be, because you don't use symbols in that thing. But you do, you just don't realize that your A, B, C, D, E, F, G are symbols, primarily that come from Latin and other ancient languages. Their form used to be symbols. The A that you're familiar with actually came from the Hebrew letter Aleph and the Greek letter Alpha. They're just forms of that thing. But this is weird looking, and you also have to read from right to left. That's the first letter of Torah over there, the Tau, at the end of the word. So not only do you have to learn to read symbols, you have to learn to read what we would call backwards. Most people in the world would call that in the same direction. What I want you guys to learn from this, and what I want to talk to you guys just about for 4 weeks, that's all the time you have to go through it, is I want you to know just kind of a broad awareness of this. Is Deuteronomy the first book of the first 5 books of the Old Testament you guys have read in your reading? What did you read? What have you read before Deuteronomy? What's that? Well, I need some specifics. So what have you read from? I mean, a lot. There's 66 books that could be in. You read Genesis? Did somebody say Genesis? What's that? Numbers. Okay. What else? You skipped Exodus? What? You read Titus? Well, we're back before Titus. So you've read Genesis and Numbers and Deuteronomy. What happened to poor old Exodus? You read Leviticus? Leviticus is really, really boring. If you think Deuteronomy is bad, Leviticus is like Deuteronomy on steroids. It really, really is tough, and so you may be glad. Well, the good news is now I know, I didn't know this, maybe Philip told me and I forgot. You've experienced a great deal of Torah, right? You've read Genesis, so you've read a lot of those stories that I'm going to talk about in here. And you've also read Numbers, which has a blend of some law code in it and also some narrative. So I'm going to assume you know what I'm talking about when I said the wilderness, the Israelites refused to have the faith to go in the promised land. They went with the 10 spies and not the 2. Do you remember who the 2 spies were that wanted to go in and had faith in God? Caleb and Joshua, that's right. I really appreciate the fact you put good old Caleb first, because everybody always says Joshua and Caleb. But Caleb gets a little bit of press there. Good job on giving him that. And they wind up living to see. Joshua is the one that leads the faithful group of Israelites in there. So the good news is you've got a little bit of broad awareness of that. Here's what I want you to really take home, is that it is absolutely important that we understand the Old Testament in order to be able to understand the New Testament. For the most part, we as Christians are really consumed with learning the New Testament, right? Because it's our covenant. It's our Torah for living our Christian life. And many people think the patterns of the New Testament are very much like the patterns of the Old Testament. Here's the thing. Do you know what they would have, if they'd used the word Bible in that day and time, what would Jesus and Paul's and Peter's Bible have been? What you call the what? The Old Testament, that's right, because they're the only scriptures that existed in the time that we have Jesus walking around the earth. And so, Jesus also lived and died under that covenant that was established at Sinai and reiterated at Moab in Deuteronomy. And so it's very important. And also, the New Testament quotes the Old Testament a lot, and it uses the Old Testament a lot. How many of you guys have ever studied or read through the book of Revelation? A little bit strange? A little bit weird? Most of the imagery in Revelation comes from the Old Testament. It uses the Old Testament more than any other book of the New Testament, even though it never does quote it. But a lot of those strange and weird imagery, like these horsemen and all these other things, they come from the books of Ezekiel and Zechariah and Daniel. And so it's important that we know the Old Testament. It's very important that we know these first 5 books to go through that. Also, we'll summarize kind of the narrative and legal portions in here. I'm not going to bog you down with a bunch of that. But the next most important thing I want you to understand is the value of reading it today. And you guys have already done some of that. If you've read Genesis and you've read Numbers, you're reading through Deuteronomy, it has value. We say in 2 Timothy 3:16, Paul was writing his last letter that we have preserved for us today to Timothy. And Paul knew he was getting ready to die. And 2 Timothy 3:16 is a verse that maybe some of you have heard quoted often. It says, all Scripture is breathed out by God and useful for reproof, for teaching, so forth and so on. When Paul says that, the context of what Paul is saying is he's talking about the Scriptures that Timothy had learned since childhood that made him wise to salvation. Well, look, there was no such thing as the New Testament when Timothy was a child. So the Scriptures that made Timothy wise to salvation and were useful were what we call the Old Testament. And also in the early church, in the early days of Christianity, before you had an assembled canon of the New Testament, the Old Testament was the Scriptures that were read in churches every Sunday. Every first day of the week they read from it. If you go back, and I know you're not going to do this because it would be very boring, but if you go back and read some of the Christian writers in the 2nd century, this 100 years after the time of the New Testament, they quote from the Old Testament all the time to prove to their audiences, because they're writing to people who don't believe in God. They're writing to Romans or to Greeks. And you know what they use to prove that there's a God and He created the universe? You know what they use? They use Genesis. They use a lot of the Old Testament. You know what they use to prove that Jesus was the Messiah? They use Old Testament prophecies to do that, just like Peter did and Paul did and the gospel writers did. They use those things to prove it. So it's critical, and it was so important to the early church. And I want it to be important to you guys in going through that. I'm going to try to keep up with my time a little bit. You'll get out at 10, right? Why is it important? Just as I said, it's the keystone of the entire Old Testament. I mean, it's the part of the Old Testament that goes forward throughout it. When we see that Israel didn't obey what God said, does anybody who studied a little bit of the Old Testament, what would you say the number one sin or the top issue that the people of Israel struggled with in their lives that irritated God? Idolatry. Yes, that was the number one thing. If we had to look at the New Testament, we would say idolatry is an issue not amongst the Jews, but amongst the people that Paul went and talked to, right? When he goes to the Romans and the Greeks in Athens, what's he going to do? They all believe in all these other deities, all these other gods, so he has to deal with that. And his second biggest thing that you see in the New Testament seems to be a struggle is sexual immorality. Those are the two things that we see talked about over and over again. It wasn't an issue, though, with the Jews. Jesus got mad at the Jews for a lot of things, right? You know, y'all are stealing from widows, you're not taking care of the poor, you're not taking care of the orphans. But he never had to chastise them for idolatry. You know why? They had learned their lesson. They'd like, you know what? Our forefathers constantly worshipped Baal or Ashtoreth or all these other gods. And we read about that. And you know what? That didn't work out real good for them. So we're not going to do that. The Jews in Jesus' day did not struggle with idolatry, but their forefathers did. Even Solomon, right? Would we say Solomon's the wisest person we encounter in the Old Testament? He was given wisdom given by God. But we can have all the wisdom given to us by God that we can stand, but if we don't use it wisely, which he didn't. I don't know if you've read this portion of Deuteronomy yet or not, but in Deuteronomy, God says, one day you're going to ask for a king over you, and let me tell you what that king cannot do. He cannot multiply wives for himself. How many wives did Solomon have? 700. Okay, I'm just going to tell you, I've got one, and that's all I can handle. I don't need 700. And then another 300 concubines on top of that, so he had 1,000 women to deal with. None of you ladies in this room want to put up with 999 other women, now do you? Okay, can you imagine a man want to put up with that much? Fortunately for Solomon, he could kind of lock them away however he wanted to in doing that. He didn't have to see but maybe one a day. But think about it. You'd have to see more than one woman a day for 3 years to even get around to all those ladies. But what they did to him was not just something sexual. What they did to him was lead him astray after their gods. We see the same thing with King Ahab. There's not one single king of the northern kingdom of Israel that is said to do what's pleasing in the eyes of God. Not one single king is said to do, and only about 3 or 4 of the southern kingdom. And so it's very important because we think about, there's a story in 2 Kings about a king named Josiah and a high priest named Hilkiah that finds a copy of the book of the law in the temple. Like somebody threw it under a table or something, and he had to dust it off, and they started reading this thing, and they're like, holy smokes, we're not doing any of these things that we're supposed to be doing. They didn't know the law. And it's very, very important to the Old Testament because it's what governed everything. Up until the time that Jesus died on the cross, this was in effect. It's the foundation of their religion and the Judaism that we see in the New Testament age. It's very important to interpreting the New Testament. Because we have to know, for example, you really can't figure out anything in the book of Hebrews if you don't know anything from the Torah or the Old Testament, right? Because most everything in it is dealing with the Old Testament and Jesus being better than those. You can't understand a lot of Romans. You really can't understand the book of Galatians. There's several other books you can't get. You can't, Revelation, we just talked about. If you're not familiar with some of the Old Testament, you can't understand anything in Revelation because nearly all of its symbolism comes from the Old Testament. And so it's very, very important and a very, very big issue because you got to think about how important this was to people, the Jews that Jesus was among and part of, and Jesus kept the law perfectly. Paul kept it pretty good because he said he was blameless according to the law. We often wonder, why was it such an important thing to them? Well, think about this. You can't even imagine this in your mind in a country that's only a pitifully young 250 years old. The United States historically is a blip in the radar of empires and human history. But you think it's pretty old at 250 years, right? This year. Keep in mind that for 1,500 years, 15 centuries, these 5 books that we're going to talk about were the most important thing with the people of God. You know, for 2,000 years, the most important thing for the people of God has been the New Testament and the Old Testament. So very, very important to them. And so if it was so important to them, we see it talked about time and time again, we have to know that context. If you don't know the Old Testament, you cannot interpret most of the New Testament. I'm going to tell you something that I try to tell my adult audiences, and if you can't tell, I'm used to talking to people that are your grandparents' age for the most part. I also teach college classes, but those college students are mostly at the master's level and are adults who have gone back to school. So I'm not a perfect teenager talker. But I want to tell you something that I harp on in my classes with adults, and you guys will be adults very soon, if not already. You cannot read the Bible with 21st century eyes. You can't do it because they didn't live like you. Their families weren't like you. Their children were not like you or the children that are younger than you. Their world was entirely different. Their scientific understanding of the universe and the earth that they lived on was completely different. Everything, they spoke a different language. Contrary to popular belief, they did not speak King James English in that day and time. English was still 1,000 years away from even being a language at the time of Jesus. You have to try to understand the original context and how those people thought. And that can be challenging because they don't think like you, especially since we're Westerners. We think very, would you say that people today in America are community-minded or individual-minded? Yes, we are very individualistically minded. How many of you hope that your parents pick your spouse for you? Raise your hand. That's very abnormal, isn't it? However, they are smarter than you and wiser than you and can choose. Who do you think picked out Joseph for Mary? Most likely, Joseph and Mary's parents. And most likely, Mary was probably about 14 to 16 years old when she got married. And Joseph was likely in his 20s. That's even weirder, isn't it? That's illegal here. But that's life in a different place than we think about. Arranged marriage is very abnormal. Now, however, what if we went to India? What if I traveled to India today and I said, how many of you think your parents are going to pick your spouse? How many of the young people would raise their hand? All of them. Just about, because you're not going to marry anybody that's going to bring dishonor to your family. So a very different world. And what I tell you to say that is be very cautious in how we look at the Bible. That doesn't mean the Bible can't speak to us today. It absolutely can. That's the wisdom of God's Word. But we have to be careful and know that. And so when I tell you it's important, and I want you to be encouraged when Philip asks you that are reading through the Bible to read an Old Testament book, it has great value to read it, and also has value towards what you're going to understand. And as I mentioned a minute ago, when we think about the scriptures of the early church, it was the Old Testament, and it was the Torah. Because we have several decades, if not centuries, until we have a 27-book agreed-upon canon of the New Testament. They read different letters of Paul, but not everybody had the different letters of Paul. If I lived in Ephesus, I may not have all the letters that Paul wrote. If I lived in Thessalonica, when Paul wrote those first two letters, we think those are the first two letters that Paul ever wrote, that all I have is whatever Paul preached to me, what was being maybe miraculously revealed to me, and whatever Paul wrote in those two letters. I don't have the Gospels. I don't have those things. When I think about the Bible, the early Christians learned a lot from reading the Old Testament. So I know it can be a little bit discouraging to go through that, but I want you to know that it's what your early church read as well. All right, I'm going to make you a little bit exciting here, a little more Hebrew in your language, but those of you guys who went to Sunday school class here as children, you probably learned the divisions of the Bible. How many of you guys remember learning some of that? You remember learning the divisions of the Bible? Well, I'm going to tell you something. Unfortunately, Christians divide the Old Testament into about like 85 divisions, right? You got to learn the history, and then this, and then that, and then the prophets, the minor prophets, the major prophets, all these different things. Jewish children are lucky. They only have to learn 3 divisions of the Old Testament. They wouldn't call it the Old Testament, by the way. They would call it the Bible. They just have to learn Torah, which I just told you. What does that word mean? The first 5 books, but what does it mean? No. Instruction, that's right. Which can encompass law, okay? Law and narrative and also some other parts we'll talk about. There's also a section called the Nevi'im. It means the prophets. And the Ketuvim, which means the writings. And so, look, they only had to learn 3 sections. How easy it is in Sunday school when you only got to learn 3 sections of the Old Testament. That would have been much, much better. So we're in a big part of it. How many of you guys have heard the word Pentateuch? Heard that used? That is often what we will hear used in Christianity instead of the word Torah. We will hear the word Pentateuch. The reason is that word comes from Greek and Latin. Also, in the New Testament, you may refer to it as the Law of Moses. You guys already probably know, because you've read some of it, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It means instruction, teaching, and law. And as far as those 3 divisions of the Jewish scriptures, Torah is the most important. Every single pen stroke, every mark in there is carefully transcribed. Some people dedicate their entire lives, some Jews dedicate their entire lives to write an accurate copy of the Torah. When Jesus talked about not a single pen stroke is going to depart from the law until all things are fulfilled, he was building on that idea that every little mark, every little pen stroke was the Word of God. It was extremely sacred to them because it was given to them. It was something very, very special. We should hold our entire Bible in the same regard. It's every bit of it is important and given to us. And so the highest level of holiness, if you want to add the complete story, you got to put Joshua in there. If you want to get them into the promised land, you got to add the book of Joshua. Sometimes you may heard this referred to as the Hexateuch. Go home today at lunch and throw that at your folks. And say, hey, I learned today a little bit about the Hexateuch. You probably will know more than they do, right? He'll be like, what's the Hexatuke? And they'll be like, I don't know what you're talking about. Just go back to eating in there. And its character, it's very, very unified, but it is diverse. What do we have in there? I told you already, we have stories that are beautiful things that tell us a lot about God's people, how we got to the point. What you're reading now in Deuteronomy is you have a lot of law code and legal collections. In the King James, the thou shalt and thou shalt not. When we have the 10 words, we have changed that to say the 10 commandments. It is better in Hebrew to say the 10 words. That we have some 10 commandments that say, thou shalt not, what? What's some 10 commandments? You shalt not murder, which I appreciate. That is a very accurate way to render that. It is not just thou shalt not kill. What else? What are some thou shalt nots? What else? Thou shalt, and nothing that the neighbor has. Nothing. Now, I got bad news for you. I know that you ladies don't like this, but in that commandment, that 10th commandment, it's a mental commandment. But unfortunately, the neighbor's wife is listed alongside all his other property. And so, in that day and time, the wife was probably considered more part of her property than equality that you are accustomed to for women in this day. But you won't covet anything your neighbor possesses at all. What else? What's that? Well, that's an important commandment, not in the 10 Commandments. That is, Jesus says it's the most important commandment given in Torah. I think did David use that in the sermon this morning? Yeah, I thought he did. I was listening passively on YouTube while I was in my office. I go to second service. One God. For Jews, the very first commandment that he puts in there, I am the Lord your God. That's the beginning of the first commandment for Jews. Meaning, there is not going to be anyone else. I am the Lord your God. You will have no other gods before my face. That's the very first one in the rules, and the very first one that they violate. We have other rules that we see. She mentioned from Leviticus, for example, we have the love of your neighbor, love your Lord your God with all your strength, all your heart. We also have love your neighbor as yourself in there. But in the 10 Commandments, we also have observance of the Sabbath, things along that nature. In that you should have read that in Deuteronomy 5, right? You also read the Shema prayer. That's an important prayer. In Deuteronomy 6, you guys remember, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, right? And you shall speak of these things. You'll teach His commandments to your children. You will speak of them as you're lying down, you're rising up. You shall write them on your door. How many of you guys have ever seen a Jewish person have a little thing on their door that they touch on the way out? You guys familiar with that? It's called a mezuzah. It is a copy of that prayer inside there. And so when God says, you shall write it on your doorpost, you know what they literally say? I'm going to write it on my doorpost. And do it. That's how important. We also see what are called regulations. I know the sacrifices are probably the weirdest part of the Old Testament that you read, right? Was that kind of the weirdest part of Deuteronomy you read about all these sacrifices? Why is that weird to you that they sacrificed for all these things? Because we don't do it. And why don't we do it? It's kind of weird and gross, right? It violates like some laws if we treat animals like that. You know, we don't want to do that. Look, I'm an animal lover. We've got 2 cats and a dog that live in my house, and we always have had animals in my house. I don't really like sacrificing animals. Now, look, I'll tell you, I do eat animals, and so maybe I'm talking out both sides of our mouth. But we don't live in a world where the general population sacrifices animals to gods, right? But they did. It was very, very normal to them. And so we have different sacrifices for different things. I know that seems super weirdo to you, but I understand it wouldn't have seemed super weird to them. We are also familiar with, can think about a priesthood, the tabernacle, the things that were in the tabernacle, specific observances. What are some days, I can think about one you ought to know pretty easily. It's really kind of close to that time right now because the vernal equinox is coming up. What is one of the 3 major observances that you know of from Judaism? Passover. Yeah, we have Passover. We're kind of familiar with that one because Jesus was observing Passover the night he had his so-called Last Supper with his disciples and institutes the Lord's Supper. We'll talk about that a lot. Does anybody know what the other ones are? There's 2 other ones. Well, that would be Hanukkah. That comes along a little bit later. We see that evident in the time of Jesus, but that comes from later on in Judaism. These are hard ones, by the way. Get another shot at it. Yes, we have what's called Sukkot, the Feast of Booths. They observe that even till today. because they lived in tents for 40 years in the wilderness, and God took care of them during that time. There is another one, and it's very closely associated with Acts chapter 2. Pentecost, that's right, which is our name for it. Shavuot would be the Hebrew name for it. And it is a festival that celebrates really the giving of the Torah at Sinai, and it comes up after about 3 months after Passover. So we see those different things contained in there. Now let me ask you this, we've just got a few minutes left here in class. We look at these narrative portions, something I know you're starving for in your Deuteronomy reading. How can, I told you earlier, and I just said it, but I didn't back it up, can the narrative portions of Torah provide instruction? They may not provide law, but can they provide instruction? I got one guy that says yes, but he's been talking a lot. So, Chris, you say yes. Who else says yes? We have votes of yes. All right, somebody tell me how. I'm going to make you real nervous by standing behind you and talking. Yeah, this drives you nuts, doesn't it? Get used to it. In college, you're going to be doing it all the time. Don't worry, I'm not going to kill you or anything. Well, how can they do that? How can y'all read Genesis? You read Numbers? How can they? Let me give you an example. Do you remember from Numbers when we talked about a few minutes ago, the spies, the 10 spies, right, didn't have the faith to go into the promised land, even though God said that I'm going to take care of you. And these are the same people that saw the sea get parted, right, and the entire Egyptian army, a superpower in the ancient world, get swallowed up in water. Yet they still said, hey, we're like grasshoppers to those people. We can't go in there. Their cities are fortified. But there were two people who said, yeah, we can. Let's go. We can go in there and kick them right on out because God said we can. Can we learn from that? All right, you say yes. Why do you say yes for? Okay. And why should we have that faith? She says it gives us an example of the faith we should have, and I think the adjective was good. An all-powerful God. And so, why should have they had that faith? That's a real hard thing to say. Why would that faith have even been there in an all-powerful God? What's that? He proved it to them, and he'd been all-powerful. What did he tell them about going to the promised land? Was it a mystery? Did he say, hey, you know what, I think maybe I'm going to let you conquer that land? What did he say? Yeah, I will. And why would you not believe in a faith of an all-powerful God when God has already proven how faithful He was to you? You've been 400 years in this foreign country. You've been enslaved for some unknown portion of that time, and I have freed you, and you walked across the bottom of a sea, okay? Yeah, I don't know if you know or not, but that doesn't happen every day. That would have been something very, very unusual. And you know, I've been feeding you from heaven every day. I made water come out of a rock. And now for some reason you think I can't do it. But He told us so. And so I connect that to us is, for those of us who've been baptized into Christ or living a faithful life, what's the greatest hope that we have one day? Heaven, that's right. Why do you have that hope in heaven? Because Jesus died on the cross. What's that? He told us so. That's right. He told you so. And so if you don't believe that, then what are you here for? You know, why are you not playing golf today or fishing or whatever it is young people do and sleeping? I guess probably what y'all do on Sunday morning if you weren't here. Apparently some people still are on their own vacation. But yes, because He told us so. And so when we look at these narrative portions, when I encourage you to read those things, we think about Abraham. He was an old man, okay? But he got his wife Sarah pregnant, who was an old woman. In case you don't know this, women in their 70s, 80s don't generally have children. But he was able to have a child because God said so. And look, Sarah thought he was nuts, right? Because the son of promise was Isaac. Does anybody know what Isaac means in Hebrew? It's Yitzhak, by the way, in Hebrew. What does it mean? She laughed. That's right, because somebody said, hey, you lady who've never born children in your entire life, and your husband who is, like 100 years old, you're going to have a baby. And not only did He tell Abraham you're going to have just one child, you're going to have childs that are like stars of the sky. Abraham's like, I'm some old guy. I didn't get started early enough to have that many children. I should have got started on that back when I was a teenager, right? We also see times when Abraham doesn't have faith in God. And he doubts God because he's worried that Abimelech or Pharaoh may kill him. Well, why would he be worried about Pharaoh killing him if God has said you're going to have descendants like the stars of the skies and you haven't had any children yet, right? Doesn't make any sense. So sometimes we see that Abraham was a human being even though his faith in God wavered. I'll tell you something about that. I want you to know this, and I want you to think about this every time you read the narrative portions, the stories of the Old Testament. Those are real human beings. I think sometimes we may tend to read those stories in that narrative portions as like maybe we read a fairy tale or some sort of fictional novel. That's not the case. These were real human beings just like you who got up every day and had to take care of things and had to feed themselves. And some of you guys are not doing this yet, but they had to feed their families. They had to take care of their children. They had to go out in the field and work. They had to do whatever they did in a normal course of life. And they had doubts and they had fears and they had concerns and they had worries and they struggled with their faith. So they're real human beings. And one of the beautiful things about these that I want you to know is, to me, I'm going to tell you the number one thing I think it makes it believable to me is that if I was going to make this stuff up, the greatest king of Israel would not have been a sinner at all. David would have never cheated with Bathsheba and murdered his best general. I wouldn't have made that up. I would make David as this bulletproof guy who had no flaws. I certainly would have had Solomon, who was wise and powerful and had this mighty kingdom of Israel. Israel at its very richest, even until today, Israel at its most powerful and richest. I wouldn't have made him a failure in his faith. I would have made him a superstar in that way. Abraham would have been just perfect faith. He never would have doubted God. He never would have tried to take things in his own hands. I wouldn't write the Old Testament the way that it's written. Does that make sense? To me, it's very believable because it's very human. And I want you to know that this law